Alabama Possible for 12 years has been compiling data from state and national resources to publish the Barriers to Prosperity data sheet. This webinar will enhance your understanding of the 2022 data sheet and will provide tips on interpreting the data published. You will also hear from people with varied perspectives regarding how to use the data sheet. So the webinar will be recorded and posted on our YouTube channel shortly. You can submit your questions using the chat feature throughout the webinar. And we'll get to it at the end. Please mute yourself so there's no feedback when our presenters are speaking. You can follow us on Facebook, on Instagram, on Twitter. So now I would like to invite our data and research manager, May Whiting, AKA our data ninja, to give us an overview of the data sheet. May, all yours.
Thank you, Manisha. Hi, everyone. Like Manisha mentioned, I'm May Whiting. I am the data and research manager at Alabama Possible. And if you didn't have a chance to attend our virtual release of the data resources back in June, I wanted to briefly review some of our resources together today. So before we dive into the actual data sheet, I want to talk about how it's actually created. So every year we utilize national and state data sets to report on all kinds of barriers to prosperity. And as you'll see when we review the data sheet, we feature several measures such as rates of poverty, food security, educational attainment, employment, and health insurance coverage. So within those measures, we aim to also highlight some pretty stark disparities across different populations and geographies. So to the extent that we can, we're trying to disaggregate the data as much as possible. So to summarize some of this year's key findings, this year, Alabama is the 6th poorest state in the country. According to Census Bureau data, Alabama has more than 714,000 people living below the federal poverty line. And that figure includes 222,000 of Alabama's children. And poverty in Alabama is definitely more concentrated in some regions of the state. So we have 7 counties in Alabama that have a poverty rate higher than 25%, compared to only 2 counties in our state that have a poverty rate under 10%. So while poverty in Alabama has actually been decreasing over the last several years, the state's poverty rate is still much higher than the national poverty rate. As you can see on this slide, the national poverty rate is 11.9%, compared to Alabama's poverty rate of 14.9%. And then the child poverty rate in the US is 15.7%, while the child poverty rate in Alabama is 20.9%. Lastly, we have median household income. The national median household income is $67,340, while Alabama's median household income is more than $13,000 less at $53,958. So we also already mentioned some of the big differences that we're seeing across counties in our state. And we also see some pretty stark disparities across race and ethnicity. So looking at the 3 largest racial and ethnic groups in our state, we see that poverty rates across these 3 groups are very different. So the poverty rate of Black or African American Alabamians is 25.6 in that teal blue bar, compared to the poverty rate of 29.2% for Hispanic or Latino Alabamians in that dark blue bar, compared to a poverty rate of 11.2% for white Alabamians in that light blue bar. Similarly, median household incomes for Black or African American and Hispanic or Latino individuals in our state are far lower than the median household income for white Alabamians. So our goal is to, again, break down the data as much as possible so that we can better advocate, especially as it relates to closing equity gaps. So we're going to take a quick look at all of our data resources. All of these can be accessed or downloaded at alabamapossible.org/datasheet. So I'm going to stop sharing here real quick. Okay, so hopefully you can see my Google Chrome browser. This is the landing page for all of our 2022 data resources. When you open up the tab, you'll find a list of all of our resources, starting off with our data sheet. So you can click this image, open it up in a new tab, and on the first page, you'll see maps, which allow you to visualize and compare poverty rates of different geographic regions. So the darker the shading of the county or the state, the higher the poverty rate. And looking at the state map on the far left, we see again that certain counties are faring worse than others. So like I mentioned, we see 7 counties in Alabama that have a poverty rate higher than 25%. And 2 of those counties even have poverty rates of 30% or higher. So close to 1/3 of the county's residents living below the poverty line. Now on the map of the United States in the center, you'll see that Alabama is one of 7 states in the country with a poverty rate greater than or equal to 14.9%. So the darker green-blue shading. And then to give you an idea of how exactly we're measuring poverty, you can review the federal poverty thresholds over on the right. For a single individual, the federal poverty threshold is $13,171. Compared to a family of 4, the federal poverty threshold is $26,496. And we say this frequently, but obviously these thresholds don't really give us an accurate depiction of what it takes to support a family of that size. But what the federal thresholds allow us to do is make comparisons across states. So towards the bottom of the first page of the data sheet, you'll see we have some charts and some graphs. Again, if we're looking at the 3 largest racial and ethnic groups in our state, we see in the bar graphs that poverty rates and median household incomes across these 3 groups are very different. Moving to the right, we can see how things have changed in Alabama and in the rest of the country from 2016 to 2020. And so, like I mentioned, while the poverty rate has been decreasing year after year, Alabama still has quite a high poverty rate compared to the rest of the country. Similarly, our median household income is much lower than the national median household income. So on the first page of the data sheet, we're really looking at a zoomed out overview. Now, if we move on to the second page, we are going to see data for all 67 counties, which you can see on either side, as well as data for the state and the United States as a whole. And the measures that we're presenting on page 2 are broken up into these big categories at the top. So this blue bar at the top tells you which category of data you're looking at. And we're going to start off with poverty rates disaggregated by demographic. And I want to spend some time on this section of page 2 because it is the most commonly misinterpreted section of the data sheet. It starts off reiterating what we saw on page 1, that 14.9% of Alabamians are in poverty. Then we see the same breakdown by race and ethnicity that we had on page 1. So for instance, 29.2% of Hispanic or Latino Alabamians are in poverty. So what this is not saying right here, this is not saying that 29.2% of Alabamians are Hispanic or Latino. Everything you're seeing under this section is referring to a poverty rate of a certain group. So again, 29% of Hispanic or Latino Alabamians are in poverty. And then this section right here is going to show us poverty rate by education level. For example, the poverty rate of Alabama individuals 25 or older who did not graduate high school is 28.5%. So another way of saying that is 28.5% of Alabama individuals 25 or older who did not graduate high school are in poverty. And you'll notice that the poverty rate decreases as the education level increases. For instance, in this last column, you'll see that 4.3% of Alabama individuals 25 or older who have a bachelor's degree or higher are in poverty. Again, this figure right here is not saying that only 4.3% of Alabamians have a bachelor's degree or higher. Rather, it's saying the poverty rate of Alabamians who are 25 or older with a bachelor's degree or higher. So I hope that clears up some of the confusion. Everything under these columns is referring to the poverty rate of that specific population. If you have any questions about that, definitely feel free to let us know. So in the next section, we have food security. We're looking at overall in childhood food security, as well as the percentage of SNAP recipients or the Supplemental Nutrition Assistance Program. Then we move on to our education measures. So here we have the percentage of individuals who are 25 or older who are high school graduates or higher, or bachelor's degree or higher. And then we also have the college enrollment rate for both 2-year and 4-year institutions, as well as the total rate. Then we highlight some employment measures, including workforce participation rate of the population 16 or older, as well as median household income. And lastly, we show the percentage of individuals who are 19 to 64 years old who are without health insurance. And then we show the role that employment plays and whether or not people have coverage. So at the bottom of page 2, we have some terms and definitions, as well as sources. And I would encourage you to please notice the year of the source of each data source whenever you're using the data. So we are going to quickly turn over to our dashboard, which is basically an interactive version of the data sheet. And when you start out on the dashboard, you are on the poverty by state page. If you click any state, it will pull up that state's overall poverty rate, child poverty rate, and median household income. If you move over to the second tab, you're on poverty by county. And you can click any county in the state and it will pull up that county's different measures that you saw on the data sheet. So I highly recommend using the interactive dashboard if looking at the data sheet and seeing all 67 counties is a bit overwhelming to you. This allows you to pick out one county at a time. On the third tab, we have our county data table. This is where you can compare counties of interest. Just want to point out that some of the table is blank, and that is simply because that particular population just might not be represented in that county. So in order to compare counties, you can go over to the right, you can deselect all, and then you can select your counties of interest. And then after I've selected those, I'm able to sort them by any of the measures which are in the column headings up here. So if I sort by this measure, I can sort by ascending or descending order. So I can do the opposite and then it switches them around. So it allows you to look at counties of interest as well as specific columns of interest sorting the data. So that is our dashboard. I highly recommend it if you're looking just for the data of one specific county, or if you're looking for a specific set of counties that you want to filter out the data for. We're going to quickly look at 3 more resources that are meant to support the data sheet and the data dashboard. Again, all of these are at alabamapossible.org/datasheet. We have our educator's guide. The purpose of this guide is to incorporate the data sheet and the dashboard into learning activities within the classroom. And it's primarily meant for secondary and post-secondary age students. So after an overview, the data discussion guide gets into some questions to think through. So these are to get students thinking about what the data means for their neighbors. And a really important part of this reflection is prompting students to consider the impact of systems, of institutions, and policies on their communities. After those discussion questions, we have the community assessment worksheet. And this is to get students to see poverty in their local context by looking at the data for their actual home community. Also, one part of this worksheet is getting students to consider how to translate that data into action outside of the classroom. So for instance, how would students advocate for policy change based on the data that they found? And then lastly, after that worksheet, we have an infographic activity. And this gets students to create a visual representation of poverty, mainly for the purpose of strengthening their communication around these issues. So that is our educator's guide. We also have a discussion guide that is meant for any context, not just the classroom. So with the discussion guide, we're really hoping to motivate people to engage in community discussions. And it's just another way to encourage people to consider the data within the context of their day-to-day living circumstances. And also it provides an opportunity to critically reflect on the data that they're seeing. So that's our shorter community discussion guide. And our last resource that we have is our newest resource. It is our toolkit. So our Breaking Barriers to Prosperity toolkit. And this toolkit is for communities that want to get involved in a more focused and long-term project. So the first component of the project is going to be the community discussions. And these are meant to promote awareness and deliberation among the convened group. So it's going to be a group in a specific community. The second component involves a virtual poverty simulation. And the goal of that is to build empathy among the participants. And then the last component is really trying to move the deliberation and the empathy building into tangible action. So the goal here is to identify ideas for both individual and community-based action. So that is our final resource. I hope it gives you an idea of some of the tools that are available to you all. And I will now turn it back over to Manisha.
Thank you, May. Thank you for the bird's eye view of the data sheet and for helping us understand how to interpret the data published in the data sheet. We will now move on to the panel discussion. Our first panelist is Kathy Miller, who is the Community Impact Director at United Way of Madison County and National Children's Literacy Consultant. One of Kathy's greatest joys is helping connect those in need with those who can help, encouraging a collective collaborative approach to service. Her passions include equity, families and children, literacy, and education. So Kathy, how long have you been using Alabama Possible's barriers to Prosperity Data Sheet, and how have you been using it?
Oh, thank you. So I tried to look back as to how long we've been using it, because our United Way is serious about identifying needs before we leap into, so what are we going to do about it? And so I've been the community impact director since 2014, and I've been looking at it since the first year that I came in. And so it's likely that this United Way has used it back. Do you happen to know, Manisha, how long you've been creating it?
For 12 years, for the
Well,
past
there you
years.
go, right on the button then. I got in right at the beginning of it. And that's so lovely, because as we have worked hard, and most United Ways at some level do, to put their finger on the pulse of their community in terms of needs, this is such a great resource for us and is a time saver, honestly. So when we think about writing grants for statement of need, or our partner agencies or the larger community are coming in, they're centered around those core issues of education, financial stability, and health. This is a great place to go, because you can quickly pull statement of need and be able to define, because nobody's going to fund you if you don't have a need. And I will say, for some of the counties that are more prosperous, we are a fast growing, we're the largest city in the state now in Huntsville. And so we're very fast growing. I always say we're in a wind tunnel of just change. So for us, staying on top of data from the census, and we do have some local folks that dive into the census regularly with us. Also, the kids count data is important to us, because we're working a lot with families and children, and also the Alabama Possible. We can pull from those sources and quickly have an update, because nobody wants to. The last time we did a huge needs assessment was 2019-20, before the pandemic. And so we don't want to work on that older data. And so Alabama Possible has been great for us in that way. And because we are a convener in the community, when we see significant pieces like some of the subsets for us, our single parents are a key factor for us to look at, because obviously they're more fragile, more stretched. And often we're seeing, since about 70% of the resources of this United Way go toward people living in a financially under-resourced situation, then that's really good information for us to look at. Also, as is typical, I think, across most of the state, our children, we have more children in poverty than adults when we break that number out. And so that's also where a great deal of our community's future potential lies. So we can break that cycle, and we're very excited to be working with several partners that are really working hard to break that generational poverty cycle. So that's just a little bit of a snapshot of how we use it. And we are pleased to see the expansion of the disaggregated information, because people may look at Huntsville, Madison County. We have a pretty high per capita income. You may think, oh, they don't have needs up there. And yet when we drill down to what we're looking at in those subsets of population, and also even if we drill down to zip code, we have at least one community here in the west part of Huntsville that's 35% poverty. And so just knowing that by being able to look at those kinds of things are very important for us to target where the need is, because we are all connected. And where the most fragile of us is struggling, then those of us that happen to be lucky enough to be comfortable are not going to have the infrastructure and the support in the restaurant industry and tourism industry and all kinds of support services and construction. The list could go on and on. Yeah. But it really is important for us. And we always give a shout out to those two counties, sister counties in Alabama, that are doing a great job in addressing poverty. That's one of the things I'll be using the data to look at, is to go look at Baldwin County and Shelby, because those are the ones I think that are in that category, to see what they're doing and maybe talk to their United Ways and do some things as we can here in the community. So the last thing I'll say is that we really do try to start with the end in mind. a vision of what this community would be without a growing homeless population, which is an issue we have happening because of affordable housing and the challenges of that across the whole community. And all of that is tied to this issue of poverty in Alabama.
Thank you, Kathy. I think you alluded to it earlier also. First, I love how you used to identify the needs. So obviously you have to disaggregate that data. And like you mentioned about Baldwin County and Shelby County, in our community conversations also that has been coming a lot. Like Shelby County does not have a very high poverty rate, but there are still pockets in there which are deep in poverty. So I think disaggregating that data and speaking to them would give you more insight on what is happening over there. So thank you. And thank you for being a great supporter of the data sheet and always reaching out to us. So thank you.
You're welcome. Oh, yes, that is something to make a point of it, isn't it? That you can call for everybody that's listening in. You can call Alabama Possible. And if they can, they will help you drill down because I don't think there's anybody or not very many people maybe on the call that have a data specialist in-house that's all they do. And so we need to rely on those experts that do have that capacity in the state to help us.
Yeah, and I did not, like I called May our data ninja, and she really is a data ninja. She knows how to break it down to the very bottom, and she will be able to help you all if you all have any data requirements or any disaggregated data that you want. So thank you, Kathy. Thank you for that shout out. Thank you.
You're welcome.
So our next panelist, Chris Mcauley, he is the Director of Communications for UAB's College of Arts and Sciences and serves on the board of directors for Alabama Possible. Chris's involvement with civic engagement began early in his career when he worked at David Matthews Center for Civic Life, a statewide nonprofit that promotes civic and community engagement in Alabama. Chris is responsible for the launch of the Break It Down discussion series in 2020, based on the data published in the Barriers to Prosperity data sheet. He facilitated community conversations in 6 counties across Alabama. So Chris, you are a new board member of Alabama Possible. Prior to that, you have worked with Alabama Possible on various projects as a consultant. So please share with us your experience with the Barriers to Prosperity data sheet.
Thanks, Manisha, and it's nice to see everyone. Thank you for inviting me to be a part of this conversation. So as you mentioned a moment ago, I served as the executive director of the David Matthews Center for Civic Life several years ago, and that's when that was when I came to know Alabama Possible. We got the opportunity to collaborate with the organization on several programs, including a 2-year college summit, multiple public forums on the dropout rate in Alabama, and many other great opportunities along the way. And it was through that partnership that I was exposed to the data sheet. And although we did not get the chance to frequently use it at the Matthews Center, I used it as the executive director to build my knowledge and understanding of the state in which I was working, especially because we were often visiting multiple counties every week. In total, by the end of my time at the Matthews Center, I think we had worked in a total of 49 or 50 counties out of Alabama's 67 counties. And so again, the data sheet was just so valuable at that time for me to better understand the counties and communities that we were working alongside during my time at the center. After I left the center, I went to a company called Markstein, which is a strategic communications agency here in Birmingham. And one of my first clients was Alabama Possible. And the data sheet came back into that conversation in a really interesting way, in that we wanted to think through how we could amplify the asset across the state of Alabama and let people know that it was available to them. We wanted to ensure through media outreach and many other creative strategies that people in schools, libraries, institutions of higher education, Alabama Cooperative Extension, you name it, that they knew that this resource was available and that it was something that they could access for free and that they could use when developing programming, as was mentioned by Kathy a moment ago, as well as when they were crafting grant proposals. And so that was a really, wonderful experience. For 4 years, I worked closely with the Alabama Possible team to really kind of turn up the volume around the data sheet. And so after my time at Marksing, I got the opportunity to actually work for Alabama Possible. And that's when I got to kind of meld those two worlds together, the community engagement piece, as well as the strategic communications piece. And so I developed a proposal for a virtual discussion series called Break It Down. We knew that we had a new asset in hand because that we wanted to leverage, which was the discussion guide. And that was developed by Dr. Laurel Hitchcock, which, if we want to make it all full circle, she works here in the College of Arts and Sciences in our Department of Social Work, and is phenomenal. And so when I saw that discussion guide, I thought, hey, this is an opportunity to prompt and facilitate some community-based conversations on on the data sheet and about the data sheet, and to create space, in this case, virtual space, because it was during the early days of the COVID-19 pandemic, but to create space nonetheless where people could come together and talk about the data that was reflected in the data sheet and kind of what that meant for their community. And it was really rooted in dialogue. So people were able to reflect on their own personal and professional experiences. They were able to hear from others in their community. In some cases, people they maybe hadn't had the chance to connect with and engage with in the past. And as Manisha noted, we really got the chance to connect with people across the state. And, again, that was where, even though virtual is not the same as in person, virtual did give us the chance to kind of break down some of those access barriers a little bit. Although, we recognize that there were some challenges perhaps around access to broadband, but people didn't necessarily have to think through transportation, didn't necessarily have to think through childcare if they wanted to attend something. They could literally join by phone and listen in and contribute and share their insights. And we thought that was a pretty important facet of that project. And so got to author a report and got to continue to iterate on what a discussion series could look like moving forward. And, the Alabama Possible team and of course, Chandra they're very forward looking in terms of thinking through how to integrate civic engagement in a very intentional way into Alabama Possible's work and into its mission and vision and programming. And so, yeah, it's been a great, I guess, decade plus now of working with the data sheet and working with Alabama Possible and thinking through creative ways in which we can, again, kind of amplify its value while also finding new and meaningful ways to engage people or to get people to engage with the asset and to think through kind of what that means in their local context.
Thank you. Thank you, Chris. And thank you for the shout out to Laurel Hitchcock. Laurel Hitchcock is the one who developed our discussion guide. And she also used to serve on the board of Alabama Possible. Chris, other thing that I wanted to check with you is, can you think of a more effective way that the data sheet can be used to actively engage local citizens? And I love what you said about how the access part was easier because it was virtual. People didn't have to depend on transportation. So is there a more effective way to use it?
So I'll kind of circle back to my shout out to Chandra and her vision for community and civic engagement within the world of Alabama Possible. And I'm on the board now, so I get to join these kind of high level strategic conversations and get to kind of iterate and work alongside Chandra as she begins to craft what this looks like moving forward. And I think Chandra and her team have really figured it out, which is moving into the Toolkit model, which of course we got a chance to see here in this webinar, and thinking through how do you incorporate virtual poverty simulations into the conversation so that there's empathy building? How do you then, in turn, connect that to these virtual discussions? And then how do you take that one step further and begin to promote public deliberation, which is something that builds on dialogue, but is a little different in that public deliberation is around community. It's kind of focused on community-based decision making. So creating space for Alabamians to come together, look at the data, talk about the data, and then begin to make decisions about what they can do at the local level to address the barriers to prosperity that they have the opportunity to identify in some of those earlier conversations and experiences. And public deliberation is again, kind of the work that I got to do, or I got to really promote while at Alabama, or at the David Matthews Center for Civic Life. And it's complicated, and it requires, highly skilled moderators. It requires, really thoughtful resources and tools, and it requires engagement and follow-up. And I think the Alabama Possible team is really in a great position to do that kind of work moving forward. So to come back to your question, Manisha, I think, the virtual discussion series and the just general access to these resources has been wonderful. But I think this next step forward with the toolkit and adding in the simulations and adding in deliberation and thinking through how we begin to move into an action-based mindset is really kind of the natural next step in this work. And I'm excited to see how it evolves and how it unfolds, because I know that this is new territory for the organization and for the partners. And I'd love to just offer one more note as I conclude, which is, I think it's really great that the Alabama Possible team is following up with the community partners and the virtual discussion participants who we got the chance to work with, a year and a half, 2 years ago on that first series, to continue the work together. I think that sometimes that doesn't happen in the context of civic and community engagement projects. That, often we get together, have a great conversation, and we maybe never see each other again. But the idea of bringing people back to the table and then adding in this extra piece about, making decisions and taking action, I think is really important and powerful. So yeah, I think the organization's moving in the right direction. And I would just encourage everyone who's participating today, as listeners, as panelists, to continue to explore these emerging assets in the poverty or in the data sheet landscape, and try to think through creative ways that you can use them moving forward.
Thank you. Thank you, Chris, for not only your words of wisdom, but also for serving on Alabama Possible's board actively. Thank you. As Chris mentioned, if any of you would like to promote any kind of public deliberation through the Barriers to Prosperity Toolkit, please reach out to us. If you want to partner with us in your counties, we would love to partner with you. So please feel free to reach out to us and email us. Our next panelist is Dr. Tondra Loader-Jackson, who is a professor of educational foundations in the UAB School of Education, where she helped to establish and formally directed the UAB Center for Urban Education. Dr. Loader-Jackson has worked on anti-poverty, anti-discrimination, and educational initiatives at nonprofit organizations, schools, and universities in Chicago and Philadelphia. Dr. Loader-Jackson, you have used Barriers to Prosperity data sheet every semester with your undergrad students. What prompted you to use the data sheet as a tool for your students to understand the barriers to prosperity in Alabama?
Okay, let me give you a little background about the students that I teach. I teach a range of students from undergraduates to doctoral students, and the data sheet is especially helpful for my undergraduate pre-service teachers. We place them in urban public schools, sometimes a few rural schools, and for some of them, that's their first exposure to students and families who are in poverty. But having solid, credible data is really important for a faculty member who teaches and who does research. And really the visual of having the state of Alabama on that Alabama data sheet and having those students take a look at the various counties they live in and make some connections there and see really the percentages of poverty in those counties, I think is quite effective, especially for my undergraduates.
So next is a twofold question. So what has your experience been with the undergraduates when they look at the poverty, the Barriers to Prosperity data sheet? What has your experience been? What have been some of the remarks, if you can share some of that with us? And then how would you recommend other educators to use this data sheet in their classrooms?
I think undergraduates especially are just not aware of how pervasive poverty is in Birmingham, in Jefferson County, and throughout the state. So really seeing those numbers is really eye-opening for them. I use the data sheet with graduate students too. It's in doctoral students, it's a very good tool because they are trained to do the research. But I will say what's been most enriching about using the data sheet is partnering with folks like you and some of your predecessors. I started out partnering with the organization when it was the Alabama Poverty Project, and then transitioned to Alabama Possible. So inviting you and others as speakers to my classroom and having them walk my students through that. I also do make use of the poverty simulation. And that was especially important during the pandemic, but prior to the pandemic, we did that simulation in my classroom in partnership with staff from the organization. So my recommendation to other people, especially other faculty members, is certainly to assign students some readings to orient them to poverty. And then if you can, have clinical settings like me and put them in actual spaces where they see what's happening. And then partnering with the staff at Alabama Possible is wonderful to do.
Thank you, Dr. Loda Jackson. I know I have been visiting to your classrooms, and it's always been a special time to be there and see how students, the kind of questions they ask, and how eye-opening it is for them to look at the data. So thank you for always partnering with us.
Thank you.
So our next panelist is Chandra Scott, the Executive Director of Alabama Possible. Chandra's passion in creating equitable post-secondary access and success opportunities for all the students in Alabama is exemplary. She believes in shifting mindsets that would result in breaking down generational poverty. And we did talk about generational poverty earlier on. So Chandra, the data sheet was originally called the poverty data sheet, but now it is called the Barriers to Prosperity data sheet. Why do you think this shift was important?
Well, first, before I even answer that question, I hope everyone is enjoying this panel as much as I have. I can't say enough about the three people that have just spoke before me. And thank you so much for giving us your perspective. I have taken copious notes here. So I really appreciate you all being here. But Manisha, back to your question, for me, the shift in the name really had to be intentional about shifting the narrative from focusing on a person or a group of people who are experiencing poverty and making the narrative be more about how do we elevate the barriers that put people in poverty and or keep them in poverty. And to me, that's where the focus should be. It should not be on the persons or a person that is experiencing, living below the poverty level. It should be about what barriers do they face, because then you can have a conversation on action. You really can't have a conversation on action when you're talking about a person, but you can when you're talking about the barriers that a person have to experience, what policies are causing those barriers, what practices or lack of practices are causing them to stay in poverty. And so to me, that was a critical and very intentional shift that the organization took in. And I really applaud the effort for them doing so, because it really showed how the mission of Alabama Possible truly is centered on removing the barriers and not necessarily just always elevating the person or persons that are experiencing poverty.
And that removes the social stigma too.
Exactly. Like that is not what the conversation should be about, and increasing embarrassment, making it those who are experiencing it to have the conversations, to show up. We want them to show up and be a part of the conversations. But if we have a stigma on them, why would they show up? We have to shift the narrative so they understand we want to help guide the conversation about how do we remove the challenges you face day to day versus talking about the person themselves.
That's great. So how has your perspective of using the data sheet evolved since being the ED of Alabama Possible, given that you also used to serve on the board before?
Yeah, so it's funny how when, first having experience with the data sheet, even before becoming a board member, I really saw it as a tool. I would say I had kind of tunnel vision, to be honest, I saw this as a tool that you use that, you're having conversations in the state, you're talking to partners within the state or within your county or within your neighborhood. You just wanted to find your county, go across the line and see where the barriers were. And so I would say coming in and now being in the position as the ED, I have much broader perspective about the impact this one tool. You would think something so simple as a data sheet would not have such an impact. But I have been able to witness at this level how this data sheet not only impacts discussions in the state, it is truly a tool that those who are outside of the state utilize to decide what funding and what resources they will bring to Alabama. Just one example, when we're talking about, quality of water in our state, especially in the Black Belt communities, there are partners outside of our state nationally that are using this data sheet that had identified to go to the Black Belt and which counties that needed the supports and infrastructure the most on increasing water quality. So they made those connections using a data sheet. And so when you see something like that happening and knowing a simple tool like a data sheet is impacting those types of changes in communities and bettering the lives of people who live in those counties, it's really an amazing thing to witness. And being able to also just understand that, using a data sheet to shift mindsets and to be able to change narratives is just as important as just being able to identify what resources to put in place. If you can shift the mindsets and narrative that people have around poverty, to me, you move faster from deliberation to action. I love to use those language from Chris. I learned so much from him. But being able to shift those narratives quickly, because it does come with shifting the mindset. If your mindset is just the person is not doing, they're not going to do, it's hard to have a conversation. But when you look at the data and you see, wow, there's actually pockets of poverty in counties that have low poverty rates. To be able to have those true conversations, that means there had to be a mindset around the narrative of understanding poverty and how it's playing out across our state. And so for me, that's been the most critical piece in I would say the evolution of my experience and my respect of the data sheet and what it offers our partners across the state and outside of the state.
And I think, if we stop focusing on the poverty itself and focus more on the breaking down the barriers to prosperity, I think that also gives us those action steps that we can take. So thank you. Absolutely. Thank you, Sandra. So how do you think the data sheet could be used by organizations within and outside of Alabama interested in uplifting the resources?
Well, first, those who are here, I hope you took notes like I did from my 3 previous panels, because they gave a great litany list of ways to utilize it versus, whether you're an educator, whether, you're helping in communications and engagement, whether you're impacting lives to putting funding in place and people or resources in place. All of those are ways that this data sheet can be and should be utilized. The only ones that I can possibly think to add is, Dr. Ms. Miller already talked about grant writing. There's a lot of organizations across our state that have to write that statement of need, to even begin to start your narrative for your grant. This is a great tool to help you really laser in on where those pain points are in those communities. Whether it's around, I think she mentioned about single family households or, women-led households, or if you're talking about education, the attainment level, if you're talking about health, what's the insurance rates, those who have coverage in our state. There are so many data points that can help you elevate your statement of need if you're doing grant writing for your organization or in your community. Policy, when we're talking about advocacy and doing policy work, you have to have that data point that's going to drive the need to make the shift in policy or create policy. And so being able to have the data sheet to really guide those type of conversations around advocacy efforts, doing policy at both the state level and the federal level for our state is very critical. And so I encourage those who do advocacy work, use the data sheet, use it to quote in, as a source in the work that you're leading, because we know if you're leading that work, you need the data tool to do so. And so this is another way to elevate your efforts in that. Those of you who lead organizations, I can speak from experience, you're always trying to make sure you prioritize your areas of focus, your areas of work, because there's so much to be done in our state, but we can't do it all. We all have to find our lanes, I like to say. And one way to do that, if you know your organization is good at a particular thing or things, this data sheet should help you prioritize what areas of focus to put your expertise. And so to me, that's a great way to use the data tool as kind of a strategic planning with your team in your organization, to get input from your teammates. Some people say staff, I call my staff my team. We work as a team. And so have those conversations with your team when you're trying to prioritize. And so again, I can't add much more because our panelists have truly given a great list of ways that they utilize this tool. And so those are just the ones that I would elevate.
So thank you, Chandra. Before I go into the questions, I would first like to thank all our panelists for this informative discussion. As Chandra mentioned, I took copious notes from identifying needs, about promoting public deliberation and community-based decision-making, to educating students about the pervasiveness of poverty in the areas that they live in and outside, and also the importance of removing the social stigma. So thank you to all the panelists. This was really interesting. And I look forward to promoting the use of this data sheet from here on out to work towards breaking down the barriers to prosperity in Alabama. So we have a few questions, and May, most of them are for you. At least the first two are. So the first one is the poverty rate threshold dollars on the first page was it for Alabama only, or is it the same number for all states?
Yes, it's the same number for all states. So those poverty rate dollar amounts that are based on family size are going to be the same for all states. And that federal poverty threshold allows us to make comparisons across states because we're using the same thresholds. And there are definitely some reasons why that is useful. However, we also frequently talk about and think about the weaknesses and the limitations of the federal poverty measure. So one simple example of that is that despite very large differences in cost of living based on where you are in the country, despite those differences in cost of living, the current federal measure applies the same thresholds to every household across the nation. So we can see why that is problematic. And if you're interested in learning more about the weaknesses of the federal poverty measure, I would encourage you to check out our last webinar that we hosted in June. We discussed that in great detail. So I'm going to go ahead and drop a link to that in the chat.
Thank you, May. Our next question, can you compare individual counties to state and national averages in the dashboard?
I'm glad you asked that because you pointed out something to me. I'm going to share my screen just so that we're all on the same page. So you can compare counties to the state rate, but it's not as easy as it should be. So I'm glad you pointed out that I need to make an improvement to our data dashboard. So currently what you would have to do, say you want to take one county of interest. So say we're looking at Chilton County. If you were to look at the rates, you would have to toggle back to the poverty by state tab to see the state rate. So in that sense, that's a limitation of the data dashboard that I definitely want to get corrected. It seems like it might be more useful if you have all of the counties here as well as the state and national rates on top, just like we have in our actual data sheet that isn't interactive. So for now, I would point you to the data sheet where you can look at that. And I will definitely make a note to improve our dashboard for the future. So thank you for bringing that to my attention.
Yeah, so this goes to prove how important it is that we have all of you in this discussion so we can enhance the resources that we have to help you all, to assist you all better. Now, the next question is from one of our panelists. I am certainly the data geek. What about those who aren't as interested in strategic planning and data? How do we best engage them? And if any of the panelists want to unmute and answer this, if you want to answer, Chandra, anybody.
I'll be glad to step in here. So Kathy, for me, I come across people who aren't data geeks like us and could care less about all the numbers. And so what I would say to that is that that's when you switch on to your storytelling mode. And you get that voice of a person that may represent one of those data points and you lift their story. So this is what, a single mother statistic looks like in Chilton County, and have their story be told about they can't work the job they want to work because it has shifts that don't fit daycare. Being able to bring their story to life, you don't even have to talk about the data point. You just share the story of someone who represents that data point. And to me, that's the shifting of the mindset and the narrative. You don't necessarily always have to do it through numbers, because listen, we know people will take a number and flip it all kinds of ways and change the whole conversation, but you can't flip a person's life experience. And so to me, you take that data point and you find a person or to elevate a story that represents that data.
So the stories behind the data are equally important. I do not have any more questions. So now I would like to turn it over to Sandra Jackson, the Partnerships Manager at Alabama Possible, to close us out. Sandra.
Hello, everyone. As Manisha mentioned, my name is Sandra Jackson, and I'm the Partnerships Manager for Alabama Possible, newly on board. But on behalf of the organization, we want to thank all the panelists for your participation and providing us with the valuable information and insight that we gained. Your time and input has helped bring more awareness around poverty rates in the state and provided, again, the insight into ways that the data can be used. So thank you again. We really appreciate it. I also want to thank the attendees. We appreciate your participation. You're taking the time to attend this webinar and gain some information and ideas on ways that you can use the data set. So thanks again, and we hope you have a wonderful rest of your day.